Welcome into the Football Guys Fantasy Football Show. I'm Alfredo Brown, joined as always by Dave Kluge. Today we're looking at our breakout players that you need to be targeting in fantasy football drafts. Dave, these are the guys that are going to potentially win you your league. These are players that maybe showed us glimpses in the past of being fantasy football stars, but either because of injury or opportunity or whatever it may be, they haven't gotten there yet. But we are expecting these players to break out and pay off for drafters in a big way this year. So why don't you kick us off with Tank Dell, wide receiver from the Houston Texans. Right now, consensus average draft position has him at wide receiver 26. You actually have him at wide receiver 27. I have him at wide receiver 23. But I think, Dave, and you're going to explain this, this is a great lesson that you don't have to be ahead of a ranking to believe that, or an average draft position to believe that a player can simply break out in a big way.
Yeah, and we did our Football Guys favorites, our my Guys show. We did that yesterday, and you can go back and look at the guys that were, rounds ahead of ADP on this one. It's guys that we like, of course, or we want to be talking about them, but we're probably a little bit closer to ADP on some of these guys. It's just kind of explaining the context as to why these guys are getting drafted as high as they are, because you might be plugging in for the first time and being like, Tank Dell, Kyle Pitts, what are these guys doing getting drafted so high? Well, let me
Spoilers.
give you the case on Tank Dell. Last year, he returned from injury in week 7 and became a full-time player. And over the next 5 weeks, he averaged 9.4 targets per game, 5.6 receptions per game, 77 yards per game, and he scored a touchdown per game. That's crazy. And that factors in one game where he had 16 scoreless yards. From weeks 8 through 11, if we take out that first game back, weeks 8 through 11, only CeeDee Lamb and Keenan Allen were outscoring Tank Dell last year. So we saw enough that we know he's a good player at that point. When you can do that at the NFL level, that's something that we typically see carry on into future years. Displayed an elite skill set last year as a very versatile weapon that could play inside and outside. And unfortunately, his season was ended by injury. Why? They had him blocking at the goal line. I will never know. But he looks like he's recovered back to 100% from that foot injury. We already saw a bit of the breakout last year, but it wouldn't shock me if he ends up being the Texans' lead fantasy scorer. And of course, Nico Collins is the guy that I prefer, and I have him ranked ahead of Tank Dell. But last year when both of these guys were on the field, it was very much so a wide receiver 1A, wide receiver 1B scenario where they were both getting plenty of usage and fantasy points. So right now with where he is getting drafted, I just think that he's a good pick, and a lot of people might want to pass over Tank Dell for some of the proven veterans, but the ceiling for Tank Dell is just sky high. That if you can get him as your wide receiver 3 or wide receiver 4, it's a really easy pick to make.
Yeah, last year he finished as the wide receiver 38. And as we see so often, drafters will remember the last thing, which was him leaving the field injured and missing the final, 4 games of the season.
Mm.
And that's all we're going to put in our heads. He's brittle. He's hurt. He's not going to, people are going to make all kinds of excuses. Dave, there is a 4-week stretch here when we finally started to see who Tank Dell was, where he was the wide receiver 1, wide receiver 11, wide receiver 3, and wide receiver 20.
Yep.
That's when we really started to see who Tank Dell was in the NFL, at the NFL level, with CJ Stroud, demanding targets, double-digit targets in nearly every single one of those games. And we're not talking like just hitting 10. We're talking about 14 targets in a game. And that was one of his worst performance, actually, out of those 4. So it's very interesting to see how high the ceiling can be for Tank Dell and this Houston Texans offense going into next year.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me one bit if we're talking about Tank Dell next year as a guy that we're drafting in that kind of tier that we talked about, that we like so many of the my guys in, like the Nico Collins, Cooper Kupp, Jalen Waddle, like that kind of back end wide receiver 1, high end wide receiver 2 range. My guess is that that's where Tank Dell is going to be going in drafts next year.
Now we're going to keep going here with the rest of our breakout players. But before we do that, I want to remind everybody, you got a bunch of ways you can enjoy this show. First is on youtube.com/@footballguysfantasy. If you're already watching this video, please take a second to like this video, comment down below with some of your favorite breakout players, maybe some players you disagree with in this video, some players you think we should have added in here. And of course, with the fantasy season here, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. That way you do not miss a single episode during the season. We're going to be giving you our starts of the week, waiver wire pickups, some trade targets that you can look for throughout the season. We got a whole bunch of content coming your way. And if you're an audio listener on Apple or Spotify, please take a second to leave a 5-star review of this show. Dave, you've got a special live stream coming up on Friday where you are going to be drafting for a whole bunch of money, some high stakes.
Yeah. $350 buy-in and a 12-team division. If you win that division, $1,500, and then a grand prize of $250,000. We're going to be streaming that Friday, August 30th at 12 p.m. Eastern. Live streaming the entire draft, but we're going to share a link in the description here on this YouTube show where you can join that draft and draft with me. Going to be a ton of fun. Our friends over at the NFFC have been hosting these high stakes leagues for years, and I'm excited to dip my toes in this year. So Friday, 12 p.m. Eastern, we'll see you there.
All right. Let's get into the rest of our players that we have here that we see as potential breakout stars for fantasy football in 2024. I'm going with a wide receiver as well, Dave, and I'm going with a guy that we have yet to see it from, but similar to Tank Dell, when he is active, when he is healthy, man, is he really, really good on the field. I'm talking about Christian Watson, wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers. He is going as the consensus wide receiver 40 in average draft position. I've got him as the wide receiver 36 in my rankings. Dave, you're at wide receiver 41. He has been an injury machine throughout his career. This offseason, Christian Watson has figured out a lot of that was coming from the asymmetry in his hamstrings. That has been fixed according to the reports. And a lot of medical professionals throughout the industry have been saying that they are not nearly as worried about Christian Watson going forward and that this should fix the injuries. And that really seems to be one of the biggest concerns with Christian Watson. It was not the talent, it's not the offense, it's not anything. It's the fact that he has been hurt. So now, if we remove that from the equation, we're looking at a guy who fits the archetype of a breakout wide receiver, a top tier fantasy player. He's in a top 10 offense. He's the top target on that offense. He's got some incredible touchdown upside, incredible athletic profile. And then I know there's people saying, well, what about Romeo Dobbs and Jaden Reed? He was really good last year. There's Dontavian Wicks people out there. There's a Bo Mountain person right here, Dave. But when we put Christian Watson up against all these other 4 wide receivers, they had 159 plays together with all 4 of these wide receivers active or on the field. Watson led the team with a 26% target share. He led the team in yards per route run. He led the team in first downs per route run, which I continue to talk about as being one of the more important stats that determine fantasy success going into the following season, which, by the way, his numbers, that's on par with Cooper Kupp, Deebo Samuel, Devontae Adams. Christian Watson is a guy that when he is available and he's playing, he is performing. This is a player who's also, he gets a lot of touchdowns. And I think that a lot of people say, oh, well, you can't really rely on touchdowns. For him, that's been the case throughout his career. He's always been an end zone target guy, 14 end zone targets last year in just 9 games. He was able to put up similar numbers as a rookie. So this wasn't a Jordan Love thing. This wasn't a 1-year fluke thing. Christian Watson is the red zone target for the Green Bay Packers. And I found a nice tidbit while I was on the old Twitter machine. I refuse to call it the other thing, but John Paulson over at 4for4 had a really great tidbit here that when Christian Watson has played 70% of the snaps, Watson has averaged 13.6 half PPR points. That would have been tied for wide receiver 13 last season with Nico Collins. When we apply his reception, receiving yards, touchdown shares from those 14 games where he plays 70% of the snaps to the Packers' expected passing numbers this season, Watson projects out to 947 yards, 11 and a half touchdowns, which would make him the fantasy wide receiver 8. Now, I'm not ranking him at wide receiver 8 or wide receiver 13, but when we take someone who's pretty smart, John Paulson, very smart in this industry, and he starts to extrapolate that data, look at the data, and just simply ask a wide receiver to be on the field for roughly 70% of the snaps, which is not that crazy, we're looking at a very, very productive wide receiver. So I love Christian Watson this year. I like the draft cost on him with where we're able to get him, Dave. And if everything just simply breaks right health-wise, this is a player that could easily be a top 24 wide receiver.
Yeah, I mean, we know the athleticism is there, and I understand the concern that a lot of people have that he has been hurt in years past, but like you said, when he's on the field, and Dwayne McFarland talked about this when he was on our show earlier in the offseason, when he's on the field with Jaden Reed and Romeo Dobbs, he's the very clear wide receiver 1. So we want the wide receiver 1 and a good offense. That's what Christian Watson is going to be, assuming full health. Health is obviously the big question mark here, but if he can put it together and if he can stay healthy for a full 17 games, finishing inside the top 20 is a very, very reasonable expectation.
Yeah. All right. Let's go to our next wide receiver on here, Dave. This is a guy that both of us really like. Deontay Johnson, wide receiver for the Carolina Panthers. Average draft position for him is wide receiver 37. Dave, you've got him as your wide receiver 32. I've got him at the wide receiver 31. Both of us are higher on Deontay than consensus. Talk to us about how Diontae Johnson, who, by the way, has been productive in the past, can be a breakout once again for fantasy football.
Yeah, and I mean, he's been productive in the past, but 1,161 yards is the best season that we've seen from him. And I think that that doesn't even scratch the surface of his
Wow.
potential. He is such a good wide receiver. And last year, he was top 25 in target share, targets per route run, air yard share, fantasy points per route run. And again, we talked about this regarding George Kittle yesterday, that we kind of have these narratives that we build about players. And Deontay Johnson, the narratives are that he drops a lot of passes. Well, he didn't drop a lot of passes last year. We get this idea that he doesn't make plays after the catch. Well, he had the most yards after the catch per reception of his career last year. His ADOT has gone up tremendously every single year, where he's not this gimmicky player that's being manufactured touches. He is running big, complex routes downfield and still drawing targets at an elite rate. And then we get he can't score touchdowns. What was it? He won like 160 something targets without a touchdown. Well, he scored touchdowns last year. So all of these reasons that we dislike Diontae Johnson, he's a gimmicky player who doesn't get yards after the catch, drops passes, and doesn't score touchdowns. He proved all of those things wrong last year, but because of those conceptions that people have of him, the perception they have of him, I think that's why you can get him as as such a cheap option in your drafts this year. Now, I've talked about it a lot. Like, I'm very in on Carolina because of Dave Canales. And if you hear Dave Canales talk about this passing game, he has said, like, we tell Bryce Young that when he drops back, he needs to find Diontae Johnson. He is going to be the wide receiver one in this offense. Talked about it with Jonathan Brooks, but they've beefed up the offensive line, they've beefed up the wide receiver room, and from the little glimpses that we saw of Bryce Young in the preseason, he looks more like Bryce Young at Alabama than he did at Bryce Young at Carolina. So picking Diontae Johnson is definitely an investment in Bryce Young and the Carolina Panthers offense, but I'm in on the offense and I'm in on the most talented player in this offense, which is going to be Diontae Johnson. And right now, I mean, it's crazy. You can literally draft this guy in the 8th or 9th round. Like, you can fill out your entire roster and then add Diontae Johnson as a bench player just in case it works out. Like, there's hardly any risk here whatsoever. So this, again, talking about at the top of the show, we said these aren't guys that we're necessarily like super, super in on. We might be kind of close to ADP. Diontae Johnson's a guy that I'm willing to take well ahead of ADP because I think that, like I said, hasn't even scratched the surface of his potential.
I mean, we've seen what the ceiling can be in an offense that's not even very good. Back in 2021, he was the wide receiver 9
Yeah.
in fantasy points overall. And I mean, that was with everything. I don't want to say going right, but that is with 100 plus receptions, 8 touchdowns, 1,100 yards. We can very easily see that here in a Dave Canales led offense. This is the same offense. I think there's a lot of talk about how Dave Canales revives quarterbacks, but I think he also gets the best out of his receivers. We talk about Mike Evans, a guy who was being criminally underdrafted last season, DK Metcalf a few seasons ago as well. Like, this is a guy who he went out and specifically traded for Deontay. There is absolutely a game plan in place there for him to get the ball a ton. So, Dave, I really like this one. And I think Deontay Johnson is getting criminally underdrafted at wide receiver 37. All right, we're moving on to, I guess, a new position here. You and I both have a couple of tight ends, hey now, that we see as breakouts for fantasy football.
You
I
been
want
doing
to
your
talk
hip
about,
thrust, Alfredo?
yeah, hip
Yeah.
thrusts,
Yeah.
the
Good for the tight
squats.
ends.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know any other glute exercises. Anyways, I'm going with Dalton Kincaid here, tight end for the Buffalo Bills, and he may not be the guy that I have ranked the highest amongst the tight ends. And actually, you and I are both a little bit lower than consensus. Consensus has Dalton Kincaid as the tight end 5. We each have him as tight end 6. But Dalton Kincaid is a guy who, once again, this is what it is with these breakouts. If everything goes right, he could be the tight end 1. And I think that's what we're looking at with the tight end landscape is you get to tight end 6, tight end 7, and you're saying these guys could easily be the tight end 1 if everything breaks right. And for Kincaid, as a rookie, he was fantastic. He finished top 10 amongst all tight ends in receptions and yards as a rookie. That's already telling me something. This is a very talented player. He's got massive potential to be a top target earner for Josh Allen. We talked about that in our last episode with Khalil Shakir being a guy who was undervalued. Well, let's talk about Dalton Kincaid, the guy who I think we know, right, Dave? Like we know for sure that Kincaid is going to be the top target earner on this team. Especially after Stephon Diggs, Gabe Davis, they're gone. That's 240 targets left up for grabs. How are they going to fill this? Dalton Kincaid showed that he could be the guy last year throughout the spurts where he was asked to be the top target earner. And I think there's a lot made about how Sam Laporta should be this tight end one. And I've talked about this before. And I really love this stretch here, the final 11 weeks of the season. Sam Laporta and Dalton Kincaid had nearly identical stats. Both of them were at 6.5 to 7 targets. Both of them were at 5 receptions. Both of them were at 51 yards per game. Their per game stats almost identical. The big difference was Laporta had 7 touchdowns over that time period. Kincaid had 2. If Dalton Kincaid has the same touchdown luck that Sam Laporta does, we're talking about him as the tight end one and what the historical fantasy season that he had. And we're not saying, oh, well, he could break out. We're saying he already did it. On top of that, looking at the first read target share for Dalton Kincaid, he was actually getting targets at a higher rate than Sam Laporta, 20% versus 19%. So Dalton Kincaid, tight end 5, it's close enough to tight end 1 overall from last year. And I love that I can just draft him, multiple rounds later than a Sam Laporta or anything like that. We just need more touchdowns from Josh Allen to simply go his way. The Dawson Knox stuff that people keep bringing up needs more context. You look back at Kincaid's best weeks, 3 of those happened when Dawson Knox was in the lineup, week 7, 17, and 18. When Dawson Knox returned from the injury, he only had 5 targets over the final 4 weeks. He's in there to block. He's not there to replace Dalton Kincaid, a guy who often lines up in the slot and out wide. So Kincaid, this is a guy who, Dave, I love him at value right now.
Yeah, I talked about Khalil Shakir on yesterday's episode, but even that, where I was talking about how much I like Khalil Shakir, I still said I expect Dalton Kincaid to be the lead target earner on this team because we saw last year he had the 3rd highest slot snap rate of any tight end. That's what we want to see. Like he's essentially the new Cole Beasley, except he's got a tight end next to his name. So instead of getting wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 production, you're getting elite tight end 1 production. So I'm completely with it. He is going to get a ton of opportunity in this offense as Josh Allen's primary target. Not overthinking it with Dalton Kincaid. And this is kind of the next guy I'm going to talk about. We talked about George Kittle. You've talked about Dalton Kincaid. That's kind of my sweet spot for tight ends this year is that back end of the elite tier. I don't like paying up for Sam Laporta and Travis Kelce, knowing that I can get similar production from George Kittle, Dalton Kincaid, potentially Trey McBride if he slides, or the guy I'm going to talk about next, Kyle Pitts.
Well, you bring him up. Why don't we do it? Let's go. But let's pick him up. Kyle Pitts, tight end for the Atlanta Falcons. Consensus ADP has him as tight end 7. You and I both rank him as tight end 7. Talk to us about Kyle Pitts.
What's the definition of insanity, Alfredo? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results?
It's drafting Kyle Pitts in fantasy football, but keep going.
Yeah. And, I want to say, like, I am not this Kyle Pitts truther. Like, Kyle Pitts' rookie season, I could pull the receipts. I said, y'all are crazy for where you're ranking this guy. And bad process, but decent results, right? Like he had 1,000 yards, but didn't score any touchdowns at all. So then in year 2, I said, you know what? I'm kind of in on this Kyle Pitts guy, like clearing 1,000 yards receiving as a rookie, as a tight end. That's something that nobody's done since Mike Ditka. So drafted a bunch of Kyle Pitts in year 2. And then, he picked up some injuries, had a down year. It is what it is. Year 3, he comes back from that injury. And I think this is where a lot of the talent and just gets lost in the discussion because last year he was clearly impacted. If you watch his early games, like he was not himself. He really struggled to cut. I think you've made the joke before that he was like Derek Zoolander, couldn't turn left. When he tried cutting to the left, he would just fall on the ground.
Yeah.
Despite that, he still led all tight ends in air yards, air yard share, average target depth, and deep shots. He excelled in true catch rate and contested catch rate, which you want to see. The problem, of course, is that he was getting terrible opportunities. Like those balls coming from Desmond Ridder were mostly uncatchable, which made it really tough. But, earlier I actually made a mistake when I said Kincaid was 3rd in slot rate. He was actually 2nd in slot rate. It was Mark Andrews, Dalton Kincaid, and then Kyle Pitts. So those are the 3 guys who are tight ends that are really just basically playing as slot receivers with a TE next to their positional designation. But now you look at the situation for Kyle Pitts. This is a guy who has proved us that he can be an elite target earner, that he draws valuable targets deep downfield, and that he can make contested catches. You pair all of that up with a guy like Kirk Cousins, it's so easy to see him breaking into that elite tier of wide receiver or elite tier of tight end. So again, we've talked about it ad nauseum this offseason. This is just that pocket of tight ends that I really like to target. George Kittle, Kyle Pitts, Dalton Kincaid, and Trey McBride. If he slides, I'm okay with that as well. But it's just I don't want to pay up for the Sam Laportas and Travis Kelsey's, knowing that I can get Kyle Pitts, who realistically could be the overall tight end one this year.
It's the same thing we talked about on last episode, right? Where tight end is just kind of pick your flavor. You don't have to go and reach for any of these tight ends. You can sit there and wait for whoever is going to be the one that falls to you at a good cost in your drafts. And it kind of seems like right now the guy that's happening with ends up being Kyle Pitts. You don't have to reach for him. Everyone is scared off of him, and he's really the last one that I think truly has tight end one upside. I think Evan Ingram is fine, but I don't think it's quite at the same level as Pitts, at least athletically, and what the target share could be. Uh, Maybe I'm wrong on that, but we'll see. Let's go to our next player here, Dave. This is one where you and I actually disagree, so I'll be interested to hear what your thoughts are after this. But I want to talk about Jaxon Smith-Njigba, wide receiver for the Seattle Seahawks. We have a lot of excitement around this offense. I am very excited about Ryan Grubb, very excited about Ken Walker, very excited about Geno Smith, very excited about JSN. Right now, consensus average draft position has him at wide receiver 41. I rank him as the wide receiver 38. Dave, you're at wide receiver 52. So this is our biggest gap that we have in a player that is in this episode. I'm looking back at JSN, and he started the season with a wrist injury in camp. So that gave him a slow start on the season. And it wasn't pretty throughout the year, but from week 6 on, he was the wide receiver 36 in fantasy. So we've kind of already seen what happens at a worst case scenario where he's getting low average depth of target usage. He's coming off an injury. He's a rookie, and the offense is pretty lackluster. He was still wide receiver 36 from that point on. We're drafting him below his dismal rookie season. And we see, you start to deep dive into the data. The team really wanted to get him the ball. They just went about it the wrong way. They used a lot of screens, a lot of routes close to the line of scrimmage. This was a guy who outproduced Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave at Ohio State. And they're like, you know what we need to do? Let's give him screens. JSN's way too good of a route runner to be used in that way. They kind of use him the same way the Chiefs were using Rashee Rice, and that's just not JSN's game. So I went and looked at it, and Dave, among 81 wide receivers to get at least 50 targets last season, JSN was 78th in average depth of target, but first in designed targets. So screens, essentially, for those of you that are watching and listening. That's not at all how he was used in college. This was a guy who was getting targets downfield, over 12 yards average depth of target in college. Ryan Grubb, their new offensive coordinator, brings in his vertical attack where he did the same thing with Rome Odunze, Jalen Polk, Jalen McMillan, who they were all over 10 yards for average depth of target. This is a guy who should be seeing more valuable targets and more targets in general. Tyler Lockett, his other competition, 32 years old. We know that production starts to dip at this point. JSN is a first round draft capital player, a guy who has the draft pedigree, a guy who has shown it in college, and I think has had glimpses of it here in the NFL. Right now, he's been having a fantastic camp. He's been quoted as being unguardable. To me, this is just another high upside second year player with a really, really affordable average draft position.
So I'm just curious, Alfredo, and I'll ramble for a little bit while you look it up. But I'm wondering where you're at on Tyler Lockett, because that's what it comes down to me. Like in my rankings, I am just so tight between Tyler Lockett and JSN. And I agree with everything that you're saying, that JSN is probably the more talented player. He's got the draft pedigree. He's got all of these things that we like to see. But I don't think Tyler Lockett's going to just disappear. Like his role has
He doesn't have
certainly
to disappear
changed.
for
Yeah.
JSN to be productive. I mean, he didn't disappear last year, and JSN was still wide receiver 36. I'm not
Yes.
expecting Lockett to go away. Let me see. I'm pulling it up right now. But I do expect Lockett to take a dip. I've got Tyler Lockett as my wide receiver 48.
All right. So yeah, I think we've just got that flip flopped where I've still got Tyler Lockett ahead in the pecking order. And I know it sounds weird, but we didn't see it last year from JSN. And I think that's really what it comes down to. I'm not going to push back too hard because I loved JSN, the prospect, but just get a little bit concerned about the situation, especially with them extending Tyler Lockett. Now, the way I could see him break out is because I've said this many times, like his rookie season struggles can be so easy to write off because he literally had a broken wrist and missed all of preseason and all of the most of training camp. And it's really tough as an NFL rookie when you're missing out on those preseason snaps in your rookie year to, get acclimated to the NFL. So I could see now that he's had a full healthy training camp, how he could easily break out and be the player that we wanted to see out of Ohio State. I'm just tempering expectations a little bit. But like I said, I'm not going to push back too hard. JSN's a very talented player. I like him and I see the path for a breakout. I'm just apparently I didn't even realize it, but I guess a little bit below consensus on JSN.
Little, you're quite below consensus on JSN. For me, it's not even that he struggled because I don't think he in particular struggled. I think the Seahawks offense struggled. The usage that he had was criminal. That's something that even a player that's talented can't simply overcome. If everything you're doing is screens, and they're like, "All right, bud, go break some tackles." Well, we're going to do the same play in a couple more reps. So just, get a breather. And we're going to do the same thing. Toss it to you at the line of scrimmage. And it's just so hard to be productive that way. And that's why I'm really happy for Ryan Grubb to be in this offense and see the vertical attack that's going to be installed with Geno Smith, with these wide receivers. And I think it fits JSN to a T because that's exactly what he did in college. Well, we want to talk about another Seattle Seahawk here because apparently that's what we're doing. Dave, one of your breakouts is a guy that you've mentioned that has some great contingent upside, Zach Charbonnet, running back for the Seattle Seahawks. And I'm taking this a little bit personally because I put Kenneth Walker as one of my favorite running backs to draft. And now you have Zach Charbonnet as a breakout. So I take this as a direct insult. But
Let's
Charbonnet
not
is
forget that I have Kenneth Walker higher in my rankings than you. So
fair.
this
That's
is one
fair.
of those where I like them both, man. Like they're both just super talented running backs, and that's what it comes down to. Kenneth Walker is talented, and the box that he has checked that Zach Charbonnet has not checked is actual NFL production. Like we've seen Kenneth Walker do it at the NFL level. We have yet to see that from Zach Charbonnet, but I'm just going back to the well here on a player that I think is really talented. And I say it all the time, but I think one of like the biggest issues that we have in the fantasy football industry is people having to pick one side or the other on these backfield committees, and they draw a line in the sand. And you're either pro Kenneth Walker or you're pro Zach Charbonnet, and you're not allowed to like the other guy. That's just silly. You can like them both. And I'm looking at the Rams backfield in a similar fashion. Like I think that Kyron Williams in round 3 is a fine risk to take, and I think Blake Corum in round 10 is another fine risk to take. Like I'll draft both of them, and with Seattle's backfield, I will draft both of them. We just know that Zach Charbonnet is a good player, and they have very different skill sets. So there is a world where they can potentially coexist with each other. Ken Walker is the home run hitter. Zach Charbonnet is the leadoff man. He's going to pick up those hard yards in between the tackles. Kenneth Walker can come in and hit the big play. But you look at Zach Charbonnet, he is bigger, stronger, and a better pass catcher than Zach Charbonnet, or than Kenneth Walker. Sorry, both of these names, they keep flip flopping.
Okay.
I mean, he is objectively bigger and stronger. That's not a question.
No,
And
no,
you
no.
look
He's
at
bigger. He's
college,
bigger. Sure.
and in college, he pulled 3 times the target share that Kenneth Walker did. And I know you've said it before, targets are earned. Like good players
Yeah,
command
but
targets.
that's also just Michigan State. Like that's how they used him. Keep going, keep going. I just wanted to. It's not quite as obvious that Zach Charbonnet is this like much better pass catcher, but keep going.
Yeah, I mean, Kenneth Walker has built that skill set up a little bit in the NFL. He's better as a pass catcher now than he was when he came into the league, that's for sure. But Zach Charbonnet, I think people see him. He's just like built like a rock. He's this big, bulky dude, and he's got surprisingly soft hands. Kind of reminds me of Leonard Fournette when he gets out in the open field and is able to pull some of these passes in. But I think we see Charbonnet get a little bit more involved in early down work. But what really excites me is the potential ceiling here, where he could, take some of the goal line work because he's the bigger guy with more athleticism that can kind of drag defenders through the goal line. And then also because we've seen him catch a ton of passes in college, maybe he gets some of that work as well. So I'm okay drafting both of these guys. Like I said, I see the upside for Kenneth Walker. He's done it for the last 2 years at the NFL level, but I also see a world where Zach Charbonnet gobbles up some of the high value touches and gets some of the passing down work and some of the goal line work and can pay off there. So overall, this is just an offense that we expect to get better. And you just laid out a very good case for that when talking about Zach Charbonnet. Well, you want to invest in Jaxon Smith-Njigba late as a guy who could really outperform his ADP. I want to draft Zach Charbonnet late. Like one, he could just be involved in the offense in some sort of committee that we don't expect. But two, if Ken Walker goes down, Then we're looking at Zach Charbonnet with no backfield competition at all besides Kenny McIntosh and DJ Dallas. Then we're looking at Zach Charbonnet as a potential top 10 running back for the rest of the season if Walker doesn't miss any time.
Yeah, I guess for me the tough thing is I don't know that Charbonnet breaks out unless we get an injury, and then I think in that case, and this is fine. Like we haven't disagreed much in this episode or our previous one, so it's good that we can have some disagreement here again. I think that's where like I draw the line for me is that a player for me needs to be a breakout on their own accord, not that there's an injury that happens. And I guess you can make the same argument that, you know, I'm kind of doing something similar, saying that Tyler Lockett is going to regress a bit and that JSN is going to come up. So I get it. By the way, just because I'm petty, I wanted to look up the catch rate between Zach Charbonnet and Kenneth Walker.
Oh,
Kenneth
catch rate
Walker
is got to be one of the worst stats to use to back up any argument. But let's go
for
ahead and hear
running
it.
backs, though. For running backs, like what else do we want to use here?
I would say targets per route run is probably the best metric to use, but let's hear the catch rate, Alfredo.
Yeah, catch rate for Zach Charbonnet 84%. Catch rate for Ken Walker 83%.
All right.
It's not. I'm just saying, like, it's not like a thing where they were totally different, and one is like clearly better. One had a lot more usage in college, and I think that's.
I do want to look at this now, though. I'm going to pull it up and I want to see. So last year, Zach Charbonnet, his target share 7.6% on 294 routes run, and Ken Walker's target share 7.7% on 181 routes run. So almost the same exact target share, but Zach Charbonnet did run about twice as many routes last year as Ken Walker did. So he was a little bit more involved, but they were drawing targets at a similar rate. And that's what you said last when we were talking about
targets
Ken
per
Walker.
route run higher for Ken Walker.
Yeah,
BT
yeah,
times.
that's what I'm saying. Yeah, so they deployed Zach Charbonnet on about twice as many routes, but like you said yesterday, I mean, it was kind of the same thing with the snap share, or the snap share was almost 50-50, but the difference is Zach Charbonnet was used a lot more as a decoy and a lot more as a blocker, or when Zach Charbonnet or when Kenneth Walker was on the field, he was getting more usage, and the same thing when he was running targets, or running routes, he was getting more targets. When he was on the field, he was getting more opportunities. Zach Charbonnet was there a lot. Like he was almost a 50% snap share player last year, ran almost 300 routes, but just wasn't getting the usage that we wanted to see, just kind of on the field.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's not there for Zach Charbonnet. This was just fun to disagree for a little bit. All right, let's go to final player we've got here, and this is a guy that both of us we're agreeing again. Yay, we're above consensus on this player. It's Chase Brown, running back for the Cincinnati Bengals. Consensus average draft position has him at running back 36. I'm often seeing him go around like round 8, round 9, round 10, even in certain leagues. I've got him at running back 30. Dave, you're higher. You got him at running back 28, and I'm not going to fault you for it because Chase Brown could be in for a massive breakout. This is a player who's got a 3-down profile. He's a receiving threat out of the backfield. He's a strong runner. He gets a lot of explosive plays. The receiving stuff is what sticks out to me over his teammate Zach Moss. The Bengals were second in pass rate last season and fifth the season before, so we know they're going to continue to throw the ball. And Chase Brown has been a guy that has been out there a ton on passing downs. And I think that's what we're going to continue to see, where Zach Moss may be the between the 20s runner, and then Chase Brown will come in and spell him there. And we're going to see a lot of passing down work for Brown. But it's not just about like how much work he can get, it's how efficient he can be when he gets that work. And Chase Brown was third in explosive run rate, just behind Devon Achane. This is a guy who can make big plays out of nothing. He did that last year. And actually, NFL Next Gen Stats recorded him as the second fastest ball carrier in 2023, just behind DK Metcalf, which I had no idea that Chase Brown was recorded as that fast. I mean, his combine wasn't that great. So to see him on the field, it shows you game speed is quite a bit different. And when we look last year, we didn't get a big sample size for Chase Brown, but he was 8th amongst all running backs in fantasy points per touch last year. He didn't get many opportunities, but when he did, he made the most of them. That put him ahead of guys like Breece Hall, Kyron Williams, Bijan Robinson, Travis Etienne, all players that were taking in the first or second round without a second thought. And Chase Brown falling to the 8th, 9th, 10th round is absolutely bananas. I don't think we should be letting Zach Moss scare us off from Chase Brown. I think that we are going to see a big positive regression for him in terms of touchdowns. He had 0 rushing touchdowns last year. And what I really want to see is the amount of usage that he's going to get. How often is he going to be on the field? We talked about how like Zach Charbonnet was actually getting onto the field about 45% of the time. Let's get that for Chase Brown here, or maybe even better. Because last season, as a rookie, he had just one game with more than 30% of the snaps, and he finished as a top 10 fantasy running back that week. So this is a guy, the coaches are loving him. They say he's earned a big role. His own offensive tackle, Orlando Brown, is saying he'd pick him first in fantasy football. There's just not many players with this type of big playability, this opportunity for touches, this explosive offense that you can get at this crazy of a draft price. So, Dave, I think we are in full agreement here. We love Chase Brown as a breakout player for this year.
Yeah, I've been drafting him aggressively this year. I don't know where he is at in consensus rankings, but I'm sure you and I are well ahead of him. He's a guy that I've planted a flag on. He's just a good player, and yeah, looking consensus has him around RB 35, where you and I are both well ahead of that. And I think the one thing that you didn't mention, you talk about the big plays and the explosiveness and the breakaway runs and all that, but the thing that it gets lost, I think, is how much volume he handled in college. That he was a workhorse at Illinois, and only Bijan Robinson had more scrimmage yards than him that final year in college. So this isn't some guy who was like just going to come in for like, 3, 4 touches a game and give you the occasional big play. Like if Zach Moss isn't good, which you and I kind of probably skew towards that opinion that, he's
Right.
probably a below average running back. It's just kind of a matter of time before we see Chase Brown's role grow. And he is a guy who could easily handle 18 plus touches a game. Now, does he get there? Maybe, maybe not. But that is the upside with Chase Brown. He's a guy who is on a good offense, who can make explosive plays, who can catch passes, who can score touchdowns, and potentially see close to a workhorse role here in Cincinnati. So, really easy pick for me. He's a guy, like I said, we're pretty high ahead of consensus, so I'll draft him based on where I have him ranked and where consensus has him ranked. He's a guy that I'd be okay taking a round or two early.
That's what I was going to ask is how early would you be willing to draft Chase Brown?
How early? I mean, I've been taking him in round 6 or 7. On underdog where
I
he's
was
getting
about to say
steamed
best
up
ball.
quite a bit. Yeah, and sleeper. Again, it always comes down to ADP for me. And these players that I'm like way ahead of consensus on, I'm not going to be drafting in the 6th round if their ADP is in round 10 or 11. I usually try to find that kind of medium ground. So, like, where I've got a 6th round price tag on a guy, if his ADP is in round 10, I'm usually looking for him in round 8.
So yeah, let's play that game here because he's going typically in round 10 behind Austin Eckler. Would you rather have Brown or Eckler?
Brown, easily.
Would you rather have Brown or Devin Singletary?
Brown,
Brown or Tajay Spears?
Brown,
Brown or Zach Moss?
Brown, easily.
Okay, so then now that pushes him closer to that Jonathan Brooks, Brian Robinson, Jalen Warren, Javonte Williams area where you'd
You
feel
must be
comfortable
looking.
drafting
You
him.
must be looking at my rankings right now because I have a tier that is Jonathan Brooks, Chase Brown, Brian Robinson, Raheem Mostert, Ezekiel Elliott, and Jalen Warren.
Yeah, and that pushes him right into the 8th round, where I think that you
Yeah.
and I would both be very comfortable getting him, and he's almost guaranteed there because that's going to be ahead of consensus on any app that you go into. So that's where I'd
My
love to
advice,
be able
just
to get him.
just going off on a tangent here, like if
Yeah,
there's a player you want in your
go for
drafts,
it.
don't like to say, "Oh, well, he'll make it back to me in the next round." Just grab him because if he doesn't, then you're stuck with a player you didn't want, and you're like, "Oh crap, why did I take Zach Moss here, hoping Chase Brown would make it back to me?" And now Chase Brown isn't there. Now I've got a running back I don't even want. Just get your guys, man. Fantasy football's fun. Have fun, and getting players you like makes it even more fun.
It's the absolute worst feeling. I did that the other day in one of our football guys bowls, and I kept waiting and waiting. So, oh, he'll come back to me. Nope, got stuck with players I didn't want. So
I mean, it's at
yeah,
the point now, like in industry drafts, like we all love Ray Davis and Alfredo.
yeah.
Props to you. Like you were on it before the draft. Like you really liked Ray Davis, but now he has been tearing it up in the preseason. I've done a lot of sharp drafts over the last couple of weeks. Ray Davis is going like 6 rounds ahead of ADP. Like you have to scroll
Sheesh.
so far down, but it's at the point now where I was in a draft yesterday where somebody drafted Ray Davis in the 10th round. And I get it because it's like his ADP might say round 16, but there's no chance he's making it to round 16 and then probably not making it to 15, probably not making it to 14. So it's like if you want these guys, these sleepers that you think are some hidden secret, the reality is a lot of people are probably in on him. And Chase Brown has been drawing a ton of buzz right now. So even if his ADP says that he's a 10th round guy, don't be afraid paying up in the 7th or 8th to get him.
Well, there you have it. Those are our breakout players for the year. We're going to be back again tomorrow with our late round sleepers, and then we're going to finish the week off with our favorite picks in each round, where we're going to go round by round, looking at some of our favorite picks there. We might have some overlap from some of these other episodes here, but that's what it's all about. It's us being able to give you guys the very best information and prep you guys for your fantasy football drafts. We're getting here to fantasy football draft weekend. The NFL season is almost here. This has been an awesome offseason. I am ready for NFL to start. Man, Dave, it's almost here. It's almost here.
Dude, it's crazy. This is the last week without football. Like
Yeah.
next week, you're going to wake up on Monday and be like, oh my God, there's football this week. Like it is so close. I can taste it.
I don't want to taste it, but yeah, we're excited for football being here. As always, I want to remind everybody, make sure you are subscribed to the Football Guys Daily News Update, where you get all of your preseason and fantasy draft info that you need sent directly to your email inbox from Joe Bryant himself. As always, for myself, for Dave, we want to thank you guys for watching and listening all the way through. We'll see you next time. Adios.